Welcome everybody. I'm glad to see such a wonderful turnout. This is a great opportunity for us. My friend and colleague Laila El-Haddad, whom I will introduce shortly, has come down from Clarksville, Maryland to be with us to share her perspective as a Palestinian-American from a Gaza Palestinian family origin. So you probably all read what I wrote, what we circulated about her amazing publishing record and her activism and the fact that she's an emerging leader in the Palestinian-American community, whom we are really honored to host here, so that she can really give us her perspective on what's going on, what it means, and so on and so forth. So I think without further ado, I'll just get going with some questions for Laila. My idea is to make this a conversation. We are videotaping it. We're not live streaming it. Jake, I think if you sit behind the camera, you might be better able to double check, or you can zoom in. Okay, good. Just to make sure that I think it'll work pretty well. So, is it straight? Yeah, sorry, my vision, my vision impairment is really terrible sometimes.
You're right, it is a little bit. But
it is true. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, Laila. I met Laila first, I think, in 2006 when I came to Gaza on a reporting trip.
I was just thinking about that this morning, and you came to my house.
Met your parents.
Yeah.
How are your parents?
They're doing okay. They're with us in Maryland in Kingsville, we're nearby.
And
they were in Gaza until fairly recently. Not this year, but during COVID. Yeah.
Oh, were they?
Yeah.
Gosh. So many stories. But yeah, they had just had an election, a legislative election in Gaza and the West Bank.
Yeah.
And to the surprise and horror of Americans and Israelis, Hamas actually won the elections.
Right.
And that then led to a coup attempt the following year, and all kinds of stuff happened. But I came on a reporting trip, and you were there. You were working as a Gaza correspondent for Al Jazeera.
Right, for Al Jazeera English had just recently, a few years prior, started their online division before they had a channel. And so I was reporting for them.
So you got most of your education in this country?
Yes, so I was born in Kuwait to Palestinian parents from Gaza who were born and raised in Gaza, and would return frequently. So my entire childhood, though I was largely in the Gulf in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Bahrain.
Because your parents are both medical doctors.
They were both physicians, that's correct, and they were trained in Egypt. In the 1960s, like many Palestinians at the time, Egypt had opened its doors for Palestinians to come and educate themselves and so forth. And when the 1967 war broke out, they were lucky enough to be whisked back with the Red Cross to Gaza because there was a need for doctors. So they went back to Gaza, and they met and got married there, and then eventually, like many Palestinians, sought employment in the Gulf, where they were recruiting heavily Palestinian professionals, Palestinians having one of the highest literacy rates in the Middle East, and being some of the most educated in the region. So though I was born in Kuwait, we would make yearly trips back to Gaza. We would summer there, and that's where my residency was, and my documentation was. First, it was a laissez-passer temporary Jordanian passport for Palestinians from Gaza, and then a Palestinian Authority passport. But in order to renew those documents, and especially the ID card that Israel began issuing to Palestinians in 1967 when it formally occupied and took control of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, it issued these ID cards, and through which it controlled the movement of Palestinians. But without that ID card, we would be denied entry back to our own lands and countries. So we would have to make regular trips back to renew the Hawiyya, as it was known, or the ID card. So that would take us from the Gulf to Gaza, on a yearly basis.
So I know a lot of the Palestinians in Gaza are refugees from elsewhere in Mandate Palestine. Your parents were native Gazans, if you see what I mean?
Yes, so my parents were both born and raised in Gaza. Of course, before it became known as the Gaza Strip, it was a much larger entity known as the Gaza District, and it was one of many British mandate districts in Palestine, historic Palestine, prior to 1948. What happened in 1948, of course, now I'm just talking about the rest of Palestinians there, but my parents were born and raised there, my mother in the town of Khan Yunis and my father in Gaza City. But in 1948, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were driven from their homes by invading Zionist militias during the creation of the State of Israel. And those that were closest to, for our purposes today, to Gaza, the largest sort of urban center to them, fled for safety there, thinking they would, be there for a short while and then return home. That wasn't the case. So they tripled the population of Gaza overnight, were forbidden from returning to their homes, and then in the Egyptian-Israeli armistice agreement in 1948 and 1949, the Gaza Strip was created in what were supposed to be temporary borders, but they were still prevented from returning to their homes. So that's why you hear in a lot of the news reporting that Gaza consists largely of refugees who don't consider Gaza their home. So something like 75 or 80% of the population of the modern day Gaza Strip are not actually from Gaza, but they're from towns and villages surrounding modern day Gaza Strip in what was once known as the Gaza District.
Yeah. So actually the Quakers have a really strong history at that time.
That's right. They were the first ones on the scene, right?
Yeah. So my understanding from reading a few books, memoirs by Quakers who were there, was that the Quakers, with the American Friends Service Committee and with the British Quaker Social Action, whatever it's called, had been doing, post-1945, a lot of kind of social work, rehab work in the IDP camps in Germany, with the uprooted Jewish populations and helping uprooted Poles and Germans, and it was a massive thing. But by 1948, it was more or less stable in Europe. Mm-hmm. So they said, well, there's this crisis going on in Palestine. Let's go there, and they actually provided all the relief and rehabilitation that was provided to the refugees in Gaza.
Right, that's correct, yes.
Before the
UN
came in and did it. So, Quakers have been there.
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
And you've done, right, well, we'll come to that in a moment. So you grew up in the Gulf, and then you came and you did your post-secondary education here, you did...
Right, so I came when I was 18 to North Carolina, attended university there, and then
a small university called Duke.
and then did my master's in Boston.
At another small university.
at the Kennedy School, yeah. Interestingly, that was through a scholarship from money earmarked in the Y2 River Accords that Bill Clinton was in charge of. I know it's interesting, though. There's actually a big New York Times article that was written about. We were part of this group of the first cohort of Palestinians who had, were recipients of this. It was called the Clinton Scholarship. And we coincided, our start of our degrees coincided with the eruption of the Second Intifada in the year 2000. If you're interested, I'll send it to you. But yeah, so after I finished that, 2003 or so, I moved back to Gaza. So in that period, I had met my husband, who's in Boston, who's also Palestinian, but grew up in a refugee camp in Lebanon. So had never had the opportunity to actually visit, his homeland in Palestine, and was also forbidden from traveling with me to Gaza because of the Israeli control and the movement of Palestinians using that ID card system that I talked about earlier.
So when I met you, you had one child,
yeah,
Yusuf,
that's right.
And you were keeping a blog called Gaza Mom.
Right, I think it was initially like Raising Yusuf.
Raising Yusuf.
And it was, this is just for context, at a time that preceded iPhones, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It's hard to remember a time when that was the case, but people used to blog before all those things existed, so yeah. Yeah, that's right. So I think the idea...
So that's why I came to meet you, because I've been reading your blog.
Yeah, and there was really just like, again, by way of historical context, there was very little being written in English coming out of Gaza at the time. Often we as Palestinians growing up in diaspora, what we noticed is that our stories were often being relayed to foreign audiences by foreigners, right, by non-Palestinians.
By people like me.
Yeah, which of course, I mean, they played a huge role. John Pilger, who just recently passed away, and others. But leaving Edward Said, of course, the great Palestinian luminary, to write his very famous essay in 1982, Permission to Narrate, after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon at the time. But long story short, that was my feeling at the time. And so when I moved back to Gaza and I was raising my son and I was getting frustrated because of the amount of times I found myself stuck on either end of the Rafah border crossing waiting entry by Israel, I started to blog really just to kind of first keep my family in touch, my husband and my cousins, and then I noticed people were interested in like this, and I didn't really feel comfortable putting all my personal business out there, and I didn't think people would be interested in that, but as it turned out, that's exactly what they were interested in, because really, I mean, it didn't occur to me, but it was very difficult to convey the Palestinian reality experience, and sometimes we felt compelled to, and that serves a purpose, to do it through sort of hard news and reporting, but really, what I learned is that it's through the personal connection that people can understand it the most, the Palestinian experience, the impact, the everyday struggle just to exist and to be, and to retain your humanity. So it was through this blog that we got in touch at the time.
So then my company published your book,
Right.
Gaza Mom. I think
Right.
it was the first or second book that we published.
Yeah, it was the first, and she said, what do you think if we turn this into, and I was like, really, who wants to read this, And
people loved it. I mean, we
Yeah.
sold foreign rights to lots of
well, and what's
different
interesting
countries.
is I often find myself,
But you can see it
Yeah.
outside. The first edition that we produced was far too big and heavy
Right.
and expensive.
Yeah, we were
So
all
then
learning.
then we did an abridged edition, which is what you.
Well, I think what's so interesting is now I often find myself, because of what's happening, what's going on right now, going back and trying to relive the entries day by day, because I was writing in excruciating detail about things that were happening, locally, but had a big impact on the sort of the national scene in Israel-Palestine, and of course now internationally. And a lot of what we see happening, unfolding now, is directly related and impacted by what was happening then. The lead up to the Israeli disengagement, and then you mentioned the elections that we could talk about, and so on. The years preceding that, directly preceding that, following the eruption of the Second Palestinian Uprising.
So just to update you, the next book of Laila's that I published was something that she and our friend Maggie Schmidt really wanted to write, a cookbook of Gaza cuisine, which is very distinctive. It's different from, like the rest of Palestinian cuisine. It's much more spicy because Gaza was always an important seaport. So, they had all kinds of things that you wouldn't find in Jaffa or Jerusalem or other places. I thought it was a very crazy idea, honestly. But Laila and Maggie were determined that they wanted to produce a Gaza cookbook. And I don't know, you guys persuaded me that this was a good idea. And so we published the Gaza Kitchen Cookbook. It's now in its third edition, which you can find out there. It made Laila into a real, culinary arts star.
I really don't know what I'm doing half the time. I just want to put that out there. But sometimes things
when
work and sometimes they don't.
Bourdain went to Gaza, who was his guide, the late Anthony Bourdain. There's some, I think you can still find the video of that.
Oh my gosh, well, I'll tell you a story about that. It recently, some random person on X posted in the beginning
Formerly
of
Twitter.
I know, I just saw the trouble thing. But she posted a clip from that piece very early on in the war on Gaza, and it got 5.5 million views. And a lot of people were just discovering it for the first time or rediscovering it. And then again, last week, someone else reposted it and it got several million views. And I've had people say to me, I had the anchor for CBS National News message me last week and say that belatedly, after he had gone to the region by his own admission for the first time, knowing nothing, and he was very frustrated because he wasn't allowed into Gaza and had to always accompany the Israeli army when he was doing any reporting on the outside. He said when he came back, he saw that clip, and then he realized that I was the person in the clip. And he said he learned more from that clip. I mean, this is so telling about the state of American media, about Gaza than he had in his whole time there. I know, and this is the anchor for CBS News, and he wants to speak to me and learn more. So I do think that again, I think we may, but it played a significant role in bringing sort of a very different, humane, normal image of Gaza to American mainstream audiences.
I mean, it's not just a cookbook. It's a wonderful
cookbook.
Going back to
it,
it's really a work of kind of sociology / anthropology.
It is
photographically beautiful.
Yeah.
You went to the Met. You talked at the Met Museum. It's really put not just your work and Maggie's work, but also that important part of the Palestinian cultural legacy really on the map. Because nobody was publishing Palestinian cookbooks.
That's right. Yeah.
Until we did that.
No, it's true. And again, I always have to remind myself, now people are maybe much more familiar with Palestinian cuisines. There's a bunch of, and again, we weren't thinking about it in that way. I really don't like to toot my own horn, but we felt like it was a compelling idea. I had always personally been very interested in food and Palestinian cuisine.
Your mother was a professional woman and said
it was really from an anthropological perspective, as a kind of, Maggie likes to call it sort of ghost archaeology, or, I like to call it culinary memory mapping, of someone being sort of dispossessed of their land, and food often being the only way that you can, learn, remember, retain, perpetuate that history. So that was my entry point into it. And I always found it fascinating, and I found it even more fascinating that nobody had thought to write about it at the time. Again, probably because as Palestinians we're always kind of in survival mode and trying to, also talk the talk, and we have, and the politics and the whatever, and unfortunately justify our humanity to the world. But so that was really my entry point, and you're right, it was more sort of ethnography. It doesn't really look like a lot of other cookbooks, but I am very proud of the fact that I had so many now well-established, Palestinian, because we're not chefs, right? But chefs and culinarians and come to me and say, you inspired me to do this, or, your book was the one that got us to feel like it's okay to write about this. And I think people always felt a little bit sheepish, why should we write about food or talk about food in the context of all these horrible things that are happening, or not just now, but before, to Gaza, right? Blockade and occupation and so on.
Well, all of that is in the book. I mean, the book has...
Yes, that's the point, is that we kind of, through the angle of food, we then discuss all these other interrelated
systems and
interrelated things. And I think that's what made Anthony Bourdain so special, is that he understood that immediately, that food tells a story. It's not just food, where so many other people, including anchormen, don't, right? They have it is amazing that he got it immediately, and yet all these other people just have been unable to wrap their heads around it. And just on this topic of food, I keep seeing in my Instagram feed so many, clips of Palestinians who have been displaced in Gaza now. I just saw one this morning of this woman making, a man actually, making maftour, the hand-rolled Palestinian couscous that's really famous in Gaza, from scratch, in a tent, He was sitting there, I was like, wow. And then through the whole process, and making the stew, and then, passing it out, and I just kept thinking, well, what does that say? What is that telling us about, first of all, how important it is to be able to maintain routine and insist on, cooking, your traditional dishes, and and sustain life and, and dignity. But you keep seeing these everywhere, whether it's the use of traditional clay ovens to bake bread, or making these very traditional dishes, or with very little means. And those are all things that we saw happening back then when we started the book, and continue to happen.
So let's talk about the present. It must be really hard for you and your family. I know that you have many family members still in Gaza. How much are you happy to share with us about what's happening to your family in Gaza?
I mean, it's, obviously it's not just my family. I feel like we have a Gaza and American, Palestinian-American group, on WhatsApp, Hani Madoun, a friend created before the war by a few months, and ironically, the main purpose was to discuss the U.S. visa waiver. And sometimes we write on the group, remember the time when that was our biggest concern, But it was to test the U.S. visa waiver. The U.S. State Department was holding out on granting Israel visa waiver status because of their discrimination against Palestinian-Americans when they try to travel there. And so they were doing this test study for a few months, system where they would allow Palestinian-Americans to go in, and if they met all these check marks, then they would give them the visa waiver status. And so we as Gaza Americans were like, well, wait, what about us, right? And so people were testing.
So that was originally just for the West Bank Palestinians.
Well, and then we pushed and said, what about Gaza? And then because they kept saying the Gaza exception. Gaza's always the great Gaza exception, right? And so they finally pushed, and then they said, okay, but there's going to be this 45-day wait once you enter to see whether you'll be allowed into areas, because there's two crossing points. It would be the main border and then the military border into Gaza. And then the war broke out, so we never. But anyway, my point in saying all this is the group has turned into, almost like a grieving, space, and like there's a running list of families who have had loved ones who have been killed every day, every morning, and every evening. Someone is writing, my aunt or my cousin has been killed, or so-and-so has been displaced for the third time, or I need help finding a tent for my family, or medicine for my aunt. Every day. So this has been our reality, not just for me, but for, thousands of Palestinian families in the U.S. and elsewhere, obviously from Gaza. So it's, what I keep saying is that it's incredibly difficult to have to continually, obviously, speak about what's happening while your family and your homes and everything that you knew is being actively genocided and erased from existence, with our own money.
Yeah.
But it's urgent and it's necessary. We have no choice. We have to do it. But, I won't lie, it's difficult, I see everything I know just completely disappear. And it's not just people being killed, they're erasing landmarks and entire city blocks, cultural institutions, universities.
Gaza City.
If you see the scale of the damage, it's
or
really surreal.
Universities.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. It's not just people. As tragic as that is, there's been a very systematic, deliberate attempt to make Gaza completely unlivable. The first things that were hit were the cultural institutions and the academic institutions and the infrastructure, the sewage, on purpose, and it's just, people are becoming desensitized and numb. Just this morning in the Jabalia refugee camp, they hit a whole area where 70 people were sheltering it, and all of them were women and children. They all died in this. There was just bodies everywhere. Just like an hour before I came here. And I just keep thinking, everyone has said this has exceeded the scale of destruction and death has exceeded anything like they've ever seen in recent history. The UN OCHA representative said...
OCHA is the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs.
Yeah, she said in all of her years working in the humanitarian sector, she has never seen anything on this scale. Never. Not in Syria, not in Yemen, not in
Congo,
nowhere. And she, in the short span of time, in 3 months, proportional to the population, the number of people who have been killed, overwhelming majority of them women and children, the scale of destruction, the intentionality, the deliberateness, the weaponization of food and water and fuel. But I think what's the more shocking is how brazen it's all been, and how our government is complicit in this, is financing this, is providing diplomatic and financial and military cover. I think that's sort of the most shocking aspect of it all. It's not like any other so-called conflict, right? And I remind people that Gaza is a completely closed zone. This is what makes it so different. It's not like there's an open space where people can go in and out of the borders. Everyone is completely locked up in there, right?
So I'm going to open this up for questions and discussion from the floor in a little bit. We have some more chairs over here if anybody would like to come over. The chair, you need to just unwrap your own chair over here. Unfold.
I'm happy to talk about this.
Yeah. So just before we go to the more open conversation, we're all working asking for a ceasefire. What is your hope for what would happen after the ceasefire?
Gosh, it's so hard to even imagine like a time or a day when that comes, because I feel like, you know, right now, as an administration, the U.S. administration has said, you know, there's no red lines, and so I feel like whatever the, you know, sort of the most depraved fantasies in the imagination of Israeli leaders right now are unfolding in front of us. They can basically get away with whatever it is that they wanted, this sort of radical right, you know, war cabinet. So my fear is that we won't even get there, that to be honest with you, that they're going to keep making Gaza so unbearable and so unlivable that I keep calling it endgame Sinai, that they're just going to voluntarily or involuntarily push Palestinians who are in such dire straits in such a short amount of time into the Sinai Peninsula. Or, you know, and by the way, this was something that had been a plan that had been developed decades earlier. You might be familiar with the Alone Plan in the 1950s, shortly after 1948. Israeli leaders at the time developed this very plan, where they called it the thinning out of the Gaza population, and they were trying to push as many Palestinians as possible in the Gaza Strip into Sinai, and then attempt to incorporate what remained of the territory, annex it into Israel. And the idea behind that is this sort of maxim that drives all Israeli policy, which is maximum control over the land with as few Palestinians in that land as possible. But the population in Gaza and the West Bank renders that a problem, because they are now slightly exceed or are at par with the number of Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and within Israel, or at par with the number of Jewish Israelis in the lands. So it makes perfect sense. So they form a demographic threat to maintaining sort of an ethno-religious majority in Israel. So it makes sense why they would want to push at least, if not all, a lot of them, as many as they can, to thin out the population. So that's my fear. That's been my fear since day one. And it's very plausible now. Like before, I thought, well, how would they do this, you know? But they kept, you know, bombing and then saying, well, we're warning, right? And then creating these so-called safe zones and pushing them south and pushing them, you know, west towards the beach and pushing them now towards the Egyptian border. So where is left for people to go? And even when we get to a ceasefire, as you were saying, then what? You know, where are people supposed to go back to when 70% of Gaza is uninhabitable? You know, I don't know. I mean, so obviously my hope, ideally, is that there is a permanent ceasefire immediately, so institutions and governments and so on can rebuild what remains of the infrastructure, at least, to enable people to, you know, live their lives, return to their homes in the north, which has been completely decimated, and which is the breadbasket of all of the Gaza Strip, and to the city and elsewhere.
So just one last question, how about the World Court? Do you think they're going to save you?
I always say we need to exercise, you know, use all cards, you know, in our hands and everything at our disposal, all means, right? Legal, political, you know. But no, I think it's important that work is being done. I don't think it's going to so-called save us, but I think it's nevertheless important, if nothing else, to be able to say that it was so bad that this is what had to happen, right? To have it sort of on the record. But I don't know, I've gotten to this sort of very dark space where I feel like nothing is, you know, it's going to get, okay, the second week of the war in Gaza, I actually met with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and he looked us in the eye. It was a group of like 8 Palestinian and Arab Americans, and he said, oh, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And so I don't really know what that means, but I mean, now looking in hindsight, you know, obviously it has, but that's kind of what I foresee, is that they're okay with this, they're complicit, and they accepted very early on that Gaza would be decimated, they being the American administration. To what end, I really don't know, because none of the goals have been, the so-called goals, stated goals of Israel have been accomplished.
Have you kept in touch with him since?
No. I did sue him. I'm in a lawsuit now by the Institute for...
Oh, right. National Lawyers
Constitutional...
Guild. Yeah. Center for Constitutional...
Thank you. Center for Constitutional Rights, CCR, yeah. And so we have an active lawsuit against him and against Biden and against Lloyd Austin.
So you might see him in court.
Yeah, maybe. We have our first hearing in a few weeks in California, yes. So, yeah.
So people, if you have questions for Laila, keep them fairly short and obviously, as friendly as possible. But really, Laila is prepared to answer just about anything, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So I'm Palestinian-American, born and raised in the U.S., and always feel like I'm put on the spot when people ask me, what about Hamas? And they're using hospitals and using all of Gaza's population as human shields. I'd be curious how you answer that when people challenge with that.
I always remind people that, this didn't begin and end on October 7th. It doesn't begin and end with Hamas. I mean, yesterday I was doing I'm finding myself so often going down these research rabbit holes just because of what's happening, and I was reading about this era, the 1950s, shortly after 1948. And actually, I'm sorry, 1970s. Okay, so I always remind people that Israel's relationship with Gaza has always been defined through repression. 1970s. So in the 1950s, actually, Ariel Sharon was assigned to this kill unit called Unit 101, and was sent into Gaza to kill what they referred to as Palestinian infiltrators, basically Palestinians who had become refugees who were trying to go back to their homes. Remind me, the book by Benny Morris talks about this, the border wars or something. Anyways, the point is he was assigned to this unit to kill and he did. He killed dozens of these Palestinians. And then later in the 1970s, he was sent into Gaza to pacify the Palestinians, Fidaiyin, resistance fighters in the refugee camps. Again, and at that time, most of them were actually, I just saw this yesterday, were PFLP. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you knew that, but that was probably the time you were writing about this issue. So, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Hamas wasn't even on the scene until...
Yeah, all the Fidaiyin and those
were leftist, Marxist, secular, okay? They posed the biggest threat at the time, and so he was sent in explicitly to eradicate them, to pacify them.
Which he did in good part by actually bulldozing huge sections of the refugee camps.
That's exactly right.
People across the border into Canada.
Yes. And so that's where he got his nickname, the bulldozer. Is he bulldozed large swaths of territory in the refugee camps, destroyed thousands of homes, killed summary execution of over 1,000 men at the time, and yes, pushed many of those Palestinians. Actually, you're right. He did across the border to Egypt.
Which, when the Egyptians made their peace with Israel, and this is maybe a little bit inside politics, but the Egyptians insisted that those Palestinians had to go back to Gaza because the Egyptians then, in 1979, did not want to have Palestinians pushed across the border.
Right. But so my point in saying all this, to answer your question, is if you just took those actors and you changed the names, you could be telling the story of Gaza today. And so that's what I like to remind people, is that the story is the same, the overall theme, right, is the same. Is Israel constantly trying to maximize control over the land, repress Palestinians, kick them out, it doesn't,
and dehumanize
them, and it does that through the dehumanization of Palestinians. It didn't even recognize them as Palestinians back then, right? They were just called Arabs. And so if you understand that, then explaining everything else becomes much easier. It has nothing to do with Hamas, but everything to do with Israeli repression of Palestinians, if that makes sense. That's usually how I answer it. I just remind them that they weren't on the scene many decades ago. Even if you go earlier, back to the early 2000s, again, Ariel Sharon was prime minister at the time. You could look up news articles where he literally says, we have no partner for peace. Arafat is a terrorist, and on and on and on and on. We have no choice, because that was in the middle of the second Palestinian uprising, which again, you see the same sorts of things happening. Israel, under Ariel Sharon's leadership, raised, I think, 2/3 of the homes in Rafah at the time. There's a great report by Human Rights Watch called Raising Rafah, the town that borders Egypt, to try, again, to eliminate so-called Palestinian resistance, to make way for this military corridor, the Philadelphia corridor, and on, right? It raised 2/3 of the homes. That was the time during which the American activist Rachel Corrie was killed, trying to stop one of those bulldozers. Yeah, and so you suddenly begin to connect the dots, and Hamas was nowhere on the scene. I mean, they existed as a group, but they weren't really around. They didn't have a significant presence until, I would say much later, 2005, right after the Israeli disengagement. I don't know if that answers your questions, but there's always going to be some excuse to say, well, we have no choice, right? Well, they started this, or they're human shielding, and we're the most moral army, and you're always going to hear these things. But the reality is, it's not really Hamas, they're after here. And if one really wants to entertain that idea, then you can say, if that was the case, why are the overwhelming majority of the targets civilian in nature? Why are 75% of the targets women and children? Why has 70% of the residential infrastructure been destroyed? The sewage and the water. Why have all of the flour mills been destroyed? Why was that the first thing to go? Why are the university? You know what I mean? So that's just sort of the bogeyman they need. But.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you for coming. You mentioned the group that you and Hani belong to. It's on WhatsApp or
Oh yeah, it's good to see you. I just saw that you were here. My brain just.
No, but I'd like to get the name of the group, please.
Oh yeah, it's actually a group specifically for Gaza and Palestinian-Americans.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you're interested, there's other groups that are doing other kinds of work.
No, because someone is giving a big gift to Palestinians right now, it's earmarked for Palestinians, and we're looking for ways to distribute that money to the people who need it most. So I'd like
I can put you in touch with Penny. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, and the other thing is, you mentioned earlier that you had to go back and renew your ID every year. Why?
Yes, so this still applies to Jerusalem residents, East Jerusalem Palestinian residents. So really, it was a tactic that the Israelis were using. In Gaza, it was up until I guess the 90s, and then they stopped, where you no longer had to renew it, but you had to add your children, or that they would lose the right to residency. But the point,
so your children have it.
all but the youngest. Yeah. I added them to my ID, but the point is, it was a tactic to try to, again, just make it really difficult for Palestinians to return home, and to then eventually eliminate them from the population registry. Does that make sense? So, I mean, this is all part of broadly Israel's control over the population registry, Palestinian population registry. So they're the ones that control who's added to that population registry, who is not. And if you're not on there, it's not like you can just say, well, I'm an American no matter how many years I lived overseas, I have my. That's not how it works. If you didn't renew that ID card, you would be removed from the population registry. And when you tried to cross over into the borders to go back home, they're like, well, no, you can't. You don't have that right. And this is one of the main points of contention. For example, when Israel claims it left Gaza in 2005 and no longer occupies it, it very much didn't, because it retained control not only over all of Gaza's borders, airspace, sea space, but crucially over the population registry. So they continue to determine who was Palestinian and a resident of Gaza and had a right to go in and out, and who didn't, if that makes sense. Now, while we no longer have to renew it, we still have to add our children to it, which is very difficult because you have to go there in person and so forth, or they lose the right to return. And Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem have it really difficult, because not only do they need to renew it regularly, I don't know if it's every year, it might be every 2 years, but if they are found to have American citizenship in addition to their Jerusalem ID card, they have to give up their Jerusalem ID card. The same law does not apply to Jewish Israeli residents of Jerusalem. I don't know if that makes sense. So if you were an American,
it doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. But again, this is in keeping with the law. There's a law that they passed, an Israeli law, that says there has to be a 75% ratio Jewish population in Jerusalem. And so to retain that ratio, they'll make all kinds of laws. Like if you didn't pay your TV tax or your whatever as a Palestinian resident, you lose your residency in Jerusalem. If you're a student and you come here and say that you're studying in university and you haven't been able to go back to renew your Jerusalem ID, it's taken away from you when you try to cross over into the border, meaning you lose your residency rights to the city, you can't live there anymore. It's insane. It's like you're being stripped of your nationality kind of thing, right? I think the most tragic and comedic example of this that I ever saw was a Palestinian I met in Asheville, North Carolina one summer. I've always wanted to write a story up, and I saw him selling ice cream, and I don't know how, at some point we made eye contact and we started talking, and I shared each other's stories, and he told me he was from Bethlehem and his wife was from East Jerusalem, and they met during the years when the separation wall was built. So eventually it became difficult for him to cross over. She didn't want to give up her East Jerusalem residency rights, so they made that their residence, but it was becoming more and more difficult for him to cross over. They would stop him because he didn't have the rights. They make it really difficult, family unification is what it's called, to give your residency rights to your spouse. So he was scaling sewers and going, sneaking in, and he was caught so many times and prevented from going there. So a friend of his said, well, why don't you go to the US and try to get a green card and a citizenship, not in order to remain here, but just so you can go back and visit your wife in your own, and by the way, Bethlehem and East Jerusalem are 10 minutes apart. And so, this is kind of the absurdity, the whole thing is very dystopian nature of Palestinian existence that you don't see, that doesn't always make the news. The everyday struggle is what we talk about, it's of Palestinians.
But isn't it against international laws to do that?
What is? Everything they're doing is against international law. I think that matters. Yeah, this is part of the problem, but I also like to remind people, we were in this great panel yesterday in Busboys with, Josh Paul, who was formerly in the State Department, and others, were reminding the audience that when you look at the South Africa-US relationship, I actually didn't know this until yesterday, but the US vetoed every single resolution calling, to boycott. Yeah, I always knew that they were the last to kind of join the call, but I didn't realize that they also did the same thing, so I don't know if that gives us hope or not, but the point is, at least the US behavior has been somewhat consistent when it comes to, calling out apartheid states, so.
I got a question. Laila, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah.
My question is, I'm glad you mentioned the experience of the PFLP in previous decades and the Israeli policy of targeted killing and assassination. They're very brazen about that. Just a couple of years ago, of course, the journalist from Al Jazeera, I believe it was, Shireen Abu Akleh,
yes.
Was shot and killed by an Israeli sniper in the West Bank. all sides, this was a homicide, it was clearly targeted. I was just wondering, given your experience at Al Jazeera, could you talk a little bit about the experience of journalists working in Gaza right now?
Yeah, in fact, this morning, I don't know if anyone saw the news, but the eldest son of the Gaza Al Jazeera Arabic bureau chief was also killed in a targeted attack on his car. And that was the second. He had previously his younger son and his wife and his grandchild were also killed last month. And today his eldest son was killed. It was just totally heartbreaking. And along with another journalist, I think making it 108 journalists that have been killed in Gaza so far. One conversation comes to mind, which is I was frequently, speaking with the Israeli army spokespersons for whatever, a response to something that had happened. I was covering it from the Gaza side. So the way it works is, you don't get access as a Palestinian journalist to the Israeli side, but I would want to get reactions because I would see a child. I remember a child would be killed. I was just reviewing my Flickr feed. It was from early 2006. Routinely, you would have children killed by snipers that were around the border, and there would just be no response. So I would ask the spokesperson, what's your response?
So you call the spokesperson who's in Jerusalem, you call them from Gaza for a reaction?
Yes, exactly. That's the most you can do. But I remember something he said to me, which was, look, we don't consider you guys journalists. We think of you as Palestinians and always legitimate targets first. Being a journalist is secondary. And that's still very much the way they approach things. They don't, when you hear these statements that Israeli leaders make, I know people like to say, oh, this is just some member of the Knesset or some right wing. This is actually what they think. When they say everyone in Gaza is a target, there are no innocent civilians, these are things that are actually Israeli sitting ministers have said. They mean it, they actually mean that. And when someone is killed, they might not always directly go after them, but often they do, journalists. Often they do, and when some soldier decides he wants to do that or kill a child or whatever, which has been documented, by the way. It's not like they will often do it just for fun. And they'll always have an excuse, right? They'll never say this was a mistake, this person will be punished, there'll be a consequence, right? So that was and continues to be the reality, that Palestinian journalists are not granted the same kind of protections as other journalists. And I suspect for that reason they're not letting in international journalists, probably. It would make a much bigger stink if some CNN correspondent was killed, right? An Al Jazeera one, so.
Yeah. I would like to know what organizations are providing, humanitarian aid. In case I might want to donate to them.
Yeah, there's quite a few, even predating the current war. I mean, part of always the struggle has been the balancing, just sort of what's supposed to be immediate humanitarian relief and aid that then becomes sort of long-term and creates a kind of dependency. It's this kind of vicious cycle because the stuff that's usually distributed is meant for short-term relief, not for long-term, and then people's diets radically change as a result because they don't have access to their sort of the ingredients that they're accustomed to using. But there's a lot working on the ground now. There's the larger organizations, and then there's smaller ones that are partner organizations. So I know, for example, there's the really big ones like antiar and UNRWA, and then there's smaller ones like Rebuilding Alliance. They work with local Palestinian, either NGOs or like community centers. And everyone, even the World Food Program has been partnering because they have no choice. They can't reach people anymore in the north or in the center of Gaza City. So they're partnering with people in neighborhoods who are just opening the equivalent of soup kitchens and cooking for their neighbors. And the World Food Program and Rebuilding Alliance is doing a great job of this as well. We'll contract with them to cook. And then there's, I usually like to kind of scatter it out, diversify. So there's Mecca, Middle East Children's Alliance is really good. The Rebuilding Alliance, there's Kinder USA. Those are the smaller ones. So there's the behemoths, the really big ones, and then there's the middle range ones, and then there's the smaller local community ones.
Yeah, I think one of the big problems is to get unimpeded access. Because as of now, the Israelis insist on inspecting every single shipment, which means that you have a great big truck loaded with pallets, and they all have to be unloaded and then put on, inspected by the Israelis and put onto another truck, which is very time consuming and expensive. And in the course of doing that, they take out a lot of things that they consider dual use, anesthetics or
and this has been the case
basic plumbing joints,
This dual use ban has been the case since 2006, I want to say.
Well, since 1967, actually. But,
really? Okay.
But I got into a conversation with somebody on Medium about this, and they said, well, we can't have the UN doing the inspections because they let in all the stuff that Hamas used to build, the rockets. I'm like, the UN has not been doing inspections ever. It's always been the Israelis.
Right, that's true.
But Hamas still got the stuff that they needed to build rockets.
Right.
So, it's not a foolproof system.
No, of course. I mean, the thing is, I lost my train of thought, but you might see calls also by Israeli officials to dismantle UNRWA. Have you seen this? It's just insane. And really without UNRWA, I don't know what would happen because they have acted as the primary caretakers for the overwhelming majority of Palestinians in the absence of a government way before the Palestinian Authority was created.
So this is the UN body that took over from the Quakers in 1949.
The UN providing Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees.
Providing relief to that 70% or whatever of Gazans who are refugees. So now...
And not just relief. Critically, they also oversee and provide education
and training
and jobs. So they serve a different function than UNHCR. So Palestinians are the largest group of refugees and the only ones that have their own
dedicated UN
agency that also does not have a protection mandate, which is another problem, right? But they also, because of their existence, they define Palestinian refugee status as inherited. So Palestinians are the only group where refugee status is inherited, meaning my husband was born in a refugee camp in Lebanon. He wasn't born in Palestine, but he still is considered a Palestinian refugee and was added on the UNRWA card and that's primarily to keep the issue of the right of return alive. And this is why the Israelis want the UNRWA dismantled, because they feel like as long as UNRWA exists, Palestinian refugee issue will remain alive, rather than having the Palestinian refugees be absorbed by different countries and then the issue disappear. Nobody will be asking for their rights anymore or whatever. So there's a reason, by the way, that so much of the resistance that you see happening historically from 1948 onwards has been where? In the refugee camps. Gaza, but also in all refugee camps, right? mean, they're the people that had everything taken away from them from day one. I always like wondered, do people ever think about that? Like, why are they always hitting the camps, Jabalia, Brej, Mawasi, Sabra and Shatila in the 1980s, right? But yeah, so.
So your husband grew up in a refugee camp in Lebanon. Can he visit, when you were in Gaza, could he visit?
No, I mean, now, just as of 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you know, we both got our American citizenship, but that he still would be able to go to Gaza. He could go as an American to visit, you know, other parts of Israel / historic Palestine. But when I was there, he couldn't come with me to Gaza. I had the Gaza ID, he didn't. Even though I applied for family.
So that's like the story you were telling about the
Jerusalem. Yeah, it's the same
Bethlehem,
situation.
Jerusalem.
Yeah. So people were often overcoming this in the 2000s, in the late 2000s, by using the tunnel network that was developed along the Rafah border that has since been shut down by the Egyptians to bring in their spouses from Egypt to Gaza. So, yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah, Debbie.
The world is watching, and Israel is not looking good, to say the least. And the war seems to be spreading. And so I have this secret terror that it's going to turn into World War III. Do you see that? Tell me I'm wrong.
You know, I think that, I don't know, I don't think it's going to, I think primarily because it's not in the interest of Arab regimes. You know, oftentimes, you know, they themselves, many of them, most, not all, are very corrupt, and their interests are not aligned with the people's interests. Their interests are aligned with the American and Israeli interests in terms of suppressing, you know, what they perceive to be as, you know, Islamism, even before that, any kind of, you know, democracy and so on. So they're certainly not going to make a stink about it. I don't know that other international actors would get involved unless they were forced to get involved, unless like the Houthis or whatever, you know, pushed them to that case, or, you know. But I mean, that's what Blinken is trying to do now. I don't know if you saw his message, but he was essentially saying to King Abdullah, like, you know, thank you for helping us keep this in check, you know. So, I mean, that's what he wants to make sure, is that this stays with, you know. But there's also something really like depraved about that, right? Like, we're okay with you slaughtering 30,000 people, just don't let it go beyond Gaza, right? I don't know what your thoughts are. You're more of the analyst in terms of the regional politics, but.
Well, we can talk about regional politics another time. There's a question from over here.
So there was a big anti-apartheid movement in the 70s, which by some miracle succeeded. Is there an anti-apartheid movement? What organizations are doing good work in this anti-apartheid?
Yeah. I mean, so there's a very active Palestinian BDS, it's called Boycott, Divestment and Sanction Movement, that was modeled on the South African anti-apartheid movement. And I want to say it started in 2006 or so.
2005 or 6, and launched actually by Palestinian Christians.
Yes. And it was sort of an attempt to also like globalize the struggle for Palestinian freedom and rights. And I mean, I would say, as measurable successes go, it has been so far successful in putting pressure on Israel to hold it accountable for its crimes, in the sense that Israel itself has recognized it as a problem and started to quickly pass anti-BDS laws and loyalty oaths, you know, punishing anyone who engaged in BDS within Israel, and you know, subjecting people to loyalty oaths if they did so. And you see all kinds of BDS laws being passed in the U.S. states, anti-BDS laws. Meaning, and I'm saying this why? Because now they're recognizing they wouldn't be doing all this if they didn't recognize it as a potential threat, meaning it was successful. So there is a very healthy and vibrant, you know, that I encourage you. I think it's BDSmovement.net or something like that. But if you look up Palestinian Boycott, Divestment and Sanction Movement, they have targeted boycotts on specific companies. They'll have divestment strategies, you know, consumer, academic, and cultural boycotts, and so forth.
You can definitely find a lot of lists of companies, like including McDonald's and Starbucks.
Starbucks? Why does everyone keep saying it?
Because Schultz the owner of Starbucks.
But
Howard
he's not the
Schultz.
CEO anymore, is he?
Well, no, but he's still a major
Oh, I see.
shareholder.
Okay.
or
I mean, I
whatever.
don't like
He-
their coffee anyway. But people always gravitate towards them. But there's others that are like some very clear ones. HP.
Mhm.
You know, they've been on the list for time immemorial. But talking about successes, like Puma was one, right? What were some other like successes that they had targeted campaigns that actually got them to
Yeah,
stop?
I can't remember, but I do this podcast regularly with Yusuf
Okay, okay.
Jamal and
okay.
our colleague in Dublin, Tony Groves, who is a great Palestinian rights activist. And Tony was saying, like in Dublin Airport, they've had to rename the Starbucks, they've had to rename the McDonald's.
Wow.
Ireland
is great. Yeah.
was really the first target of English settler
Yes,
colonialism.
yes.
So they kind of really get what's happened to Palestinians.
Yes,
And
yes.
like this Irish member of the European Parliament, Claire Daly, is the most
Yes,
outspoken.
yes. But there is, I mean, that's one thing you can do is in whatever state you live in, check to see when the state legislature, I guarantee you, every year they have these attempts to pass anti-BDS laws and people lobby against them. And, we've had successes on that front as well.
So I do have this little vision impairment on this side. But
Okay.
I see that there
Yes,
are
yes,
three
yeah.
people on this
That's
side.
okay,
That
yeah.
There was the lady standing up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're just starting to mention it.
Sorry, could you speak up?
Oh,
I can
yes,
hear her, it's okay, she's
A
saying.
lot of us are asking ourselves every day, what more can we do, what
Right,
more can
right.
we do? I think both in terms of how we can hope to change the minds of our
Yeah.
friends who don't see the gravity of this crisis and who might support the war because of some of the reasons that you mentioned. And two is what can we do, in terms of our time, our donations, how can we help?
Yesterday I was part of this panel with Hazami. I don't know if you are familiar with her. She's
From Seeds of Peace, Postan.
no, the different Hazami. Anyway, she does a lot of DC-based daily actions. What's going on? Oh yeah.
I have the link
She's
for
incredible.
sign up.
Huh?
I said I have the link for this week's action.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but me and her were both at the Kennedy School together, so we know each other. But anyways, she gave a great presentation on like sort of activism 101 and was explaining how to impact and influence in different tiers of people. What I usually tell people is, first of all, what's like your strength? What's your time commitment? What are your personal strengths? What are you capable of doing? Because there's a lot of different sort of entry points, right? Maybe your thing is calling daily. I have someone who that's all they do. They phone bank, they make sure people do, they get 400 calls from Maryland every day or whatever. That's what they do, right? Someone else might be better at like lobbying, so they train people on how to go and they set up meetings with different congressmen when other people might not be familiar with how to do it, and they dedicate all their time to that. They set up meetings daily, they go, and other people feel like it's more impactful. Usually historically, right, change comes from outside of the halls of power. And there's sort of she was talking about this critical mass. She was saying it's like the 3% rule. Have you heard about this? When 3% of the population, their perspective shifts, then you begin to see change. And her point was that often we think of actions as having to be really big, centralized things. But she was making the point that they're sometimes more impactful when they're decentralized, and you and 4 friends decide we're going to do this one action every week at this one place, or disrupt a certain area, regularly with, she has these great little flyers with a barcode that talk about what's going on and so on. And sometimes they'll do mall leaflet drops, right? Sometimes they'll be at a really busy intersection and they'll do a dine where everybody falls, and then they'll have the flyers, and people who are curious come around. And she's saying that's hard. The idea is to make people uncomfortable, but not scream in their face, right? And then provide them with information for them to educate themselves. So, and I really like that idea because it adds up. Sometimes we do feel the weight is so unbearable that we almost shut down and we don't know what to do, or we just want to donate and get it over with. But these actions, really, really do make a difference. Whether you're phone banking, whether you're participating in whether you're just organizing in your small community or circle. Maybe you belong to a church or a community center. Sometimes if I'm at the gym, I'm like, God, do any of these people know what's going on? And I want to say something, but I don't know how. So conversation starters are a good idea too. wearing a ceasefire now. She was wearing a ceasefire now shirt in like Mississippi, and someone came up to her and was like, "Is that a band?" You know? So I'm like, someone should make a band and call it ceasefire now. But anyway, the point is that even that was a conversation starter, and then she had the opportunity to be like, "No, but let me tell you what it means," right? And so those are all very simple, depending on what your target audience is. All very simple strategies. Maybe hosting a supper club. You know what I mean? Again, a conversation starter. I mean, I really do actively encourage, it's the people that I want to reach the most are the ones that are totally uninformed, to be honest with you. Whether they're in churches or in your gym or you belong to some community group, those are the ones that we should be, if we have those people, reaching out to. You know, so I don't know, and sort of not, that was kind of the idea behind the cookbook, by the way, is to try to reach those groups of people, so.
Steve, did you have a question?
I didn't have a question. It was a response about the anti-apartheid. Is that the Peace and Social Concerns Committee has joined apartheid-free community and is going to raise a proposal that the meeting itself does it. And that's existed for about a year and a half in the United States. It's an interfaith effort that's administered by the American Friends Service Committee. And that they also have regular meetings so people are learning from each other after you sort of take the pledge to be an apartheid-free congregation. How do you live into that? And so that's something that will come at a business meeting sometime early this year here, but it's a new initiative of U.S. organizations, denominations, and congregations that are explicitly saying we take a pledge against apartheid in Palestine, Israel-Palestine, and we will start living into it and taking actions.
Thanks for that reminder. Michael, did you have a question earlier?
Yes, thank you for coming. Thank you for all your service and work. Much of the mainstream media refers to this as the Israeli-Hamas war, rather than the Israeli-Gaza war, or the Israeli war in Gaza, or the Israeli war in Palestine. How do you feel about that?
Well, if you noticed, I explicitly always say the Israeli war on Gaza because that's what it is. I don't even, allow, even when I'm speaking on media, I just immediately will say it like it is. I will take over the narrative and narrate myself exactly as I see it. So it's not, I mentioned earlier, it's clearly not a war on Hamas. All from day one, you could see very early on, all of the evidence points to the fact that this is, including statements by Israeli leaders themselves, which is why, to your point about, the different, genocide claims, is because it's, the intent has been very clear, right? So usually the burden of proof is to show, I'm sorry, I'm not being articulate, is to show the intent, but they made that very clear by saying very early on, this is what we plan to do. We will make Gaza unlivable. We will turn Gaza into ruins, said Netanyahu. We will prevent the entry of water, food, and fuel. That's not a war on Hamas, right? By their own admission, that's a war on everyone in Gaza. So I absolutely reject that claim. And I know earlier somebody had asked about the Hamas thing, but it's often, the point has often been made, if that was who you were really going after, that still doesn't justify blowing up the entire place, right? So, not to mention, as Palestinian lawmaker Hanan Ashrawi has rightly pointed out many a time, Hamas is a political organization that is deeply embedded into the fabric of Palestinian society, a political and social, organization, one of many different, organizations. And it's not like some rogue group that fell out of, from space, onto the scene, right? And so her point was just that. They have existed for a long time. They're part of the social fabric, for better or for worse. They have supporters, they have detractors, right? And they were considered by Palestinians to be part of the fabric of society. So I think when you understand that context, it kind of renders all their claims a little, ridiculous. They might take contention, obviously, with their strategies. They might take contention with whatever, but it's absolutely a lie to say that this is a war just against them.
Kind of analogous, in my view, to the African National Congress in South Africa, which was, had a very broad social and political presence in very difficult circumstances in the townships, but it also had a military wing. And when Nelson Mandela was arrested, what was he arrested for? He was arrested for having founded the military wing. Now everybody thinks, oh, Nelson Mandela, kumbaya, always a pacifist, definitely right up there with Gandhi. No, he was the founder of the military wing.
Right.
And yet he was the person in the end that they found they had to negotiate with.
Right, that's exactly
and that
right.
has always been the case.
Yes.
Like growing up in England as it was decolonizing, it's like, oh, the Mau Mau, the worst thing ever in Kenya. They do this, they do that. Who did they end up negotiating with? Jomo Kenyatta. I mean,
it's so interesting when you do look at history and those examples, because suddenly your perspective shifts a little bit in terms of how you view.
Oh, we've got a lot of questions. There's one in the back there.
I wanted to ask about the use of social media, particularly those of us who are in these circles where, many of us are very eager for there to be a ceasefire, but as a mother, as someone who professionally deals a lot with women's rights issues, children's rights issues, and thinking about, for example, the strategic use of Emmett Till's body by his mother versus what it means for other people to kind of say, well, that's the same as my son. That's not your son. Like, I as a Black person can grieve and can honor, but that's not my child, and I think it's important to recognize that. I've been disturbed by friends of mine, some of their use of, in good faith, but their use of, to me, the bodies of Palestinian children to try to make a point. I'm not being very articulate on this, but is there anything you can say about especially people who are, what they're trying to do, but this is someone else's child?
Yeah, I think, that's a really tough, it's a very good nuanced question. I think sort of collectively Palestinians right now, we're just in survival mode. We haven't even gotten to the point where we're able to grieve yet. That I don't even think we've processed those kinds of things. Everyone is just, let me put it this way, we don't even have the luxury to make those kinds of decisions at this point. We're just, literally, especially if you're in Gaza at this moment. I just remember seeing the face of this his name is Anas Sharif, this Al Jazeera correspondent for Arabic in Jabalia. He's one of the only journalists in the north right now. And the look on his face, the trauma when he was walking around this morning amongst these 70 little bodies and literally saying, I don't even know what to say anymore. I don't know how to describe this. I'm saying this every day. And he's like numb. And no one is seeing this or doing anything or moved by this. That I don't even think we've got to the point where we can say, well, don't do that, because it's, I think Palestinians are just like, whatever works at this point. If it means doing that, then do it. I'm thinking in the mindset of a Palestinian. But also, it brings to mind this clip. So in short, I don't think Palestinians would think necessarily, we haven't got to the point where we can say, that's a problem, let's use a different tactic, obviously, there'll be others that say we'll be sensitive and so on, but I really think that they're just literally, dying, being genocided, and are just saying, if that's the strategy that's going to work, then use it. If it's not, then... But it does remind me of a clip from this Palestinian series that was called, I think I mentioned to you, Taghriban, the Palestinian Estrangement, that was filmed in the early 2000s, and it's just phenomenal. We're trying to get it translated. But it follows the story of a Palestinian family from like the 1930s to the modern day as they become, refugees and displaced and, so on. But there's this one clip where they become new refugees in a refugee camp in Tul Kerim in the West Bank, and some foreign journalists come in to try to take pictures of them. And one of the brothers is guiding the journalists, and the other brother is really offended and saying, like, we're not, on display for these journalists, and they get in this big argument, which I thought was, again, a very sort of nuanced way of tackling that issue. Like, one felt he had no choice, yes, this isn't what, but I have to show the world what's going on. And the other was like, no, this isn't what they could be seeing, this isn't dignified, this isn't humanizing. So, I would say that's the closest I can say in the debate. And those debates exist, but unfortunately, again, we're not afforded the ability to even have them at this point. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I don't see anything wrong necessarily with if you're saying, whether it's in a protest or a march, talking about a Palestinian that was killed. I think that's, you know, as long as the intention is correct and being used, you know.
So,
there's a question over here. He's had his hand up.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
So, the basic fundamental Quaker understanding is that war is not the answer. Peace is the answer. And that war is not the answer works both on a moral level and on a practical level. I mean, Israel's used October 7th as a justification for everything.
Sure.
Anyway, war is not the answer. Are there any groups in Gaza that are advocating peace?
I mean, Palestinians for their entire existence have wanted nothing more than to live, you know, in peace and with full and equal rights.
Is there someone we could get in touch with and work with?
Well, so I guess let me backtrack. What do you mean by, you know, peace? By working towards peace?
People who, I know specifically what I mean. People who have renounced violence as a way to achieve social justice.
So could I just
go ahead.
come in here? In 2018, there was a very, very vibrant group in Gaza, led by a wonderful guy called Ahmed Abu Tema, who came here to this country and did a speaking tour, as I recall, with the Friends, and they, week after week after week, did systematic, non-violent marches. It was called the Great March of Return, and they were trying to implement the right of return that has been guaranteed to Palestinians since 1948, to return in peace to their properties and homes and farms, the other side of the demarcation line. And the Israelis, week after week after week, put snipers on the border and sniped them. I think they killed 200 people.
Oh,
and they definitely amputated. I mean, they shot for the legs, and so you have whole, you know, football leagues of people who play football with one leg, and I think that continued.
And actually, Ahmed's, it was about I want to say 2 to 3 years.
Yeah,
I was there during the time that it was active when I visited. But his son his house was hit, and I think he was the intended target, Ahmed, a few weeks ago, and he was holding his son in his arms, and his son died, and he survived. And he was the most sort of soft-spoken, non-violent activist you can think of. So I think it's a myth to say that there's never been, there's two components. Never been, non-violent activism on part of Palestinians. Essentially, all of the first Intifada or Palestinian uprising was non-violent activism, right? It was symbolic.
In Gaza and in the
everywhere. In Gaza, the West Bank, it involved strikes and symbolic throwing of stones and so on. But it doesn't matter if it's small arms, big arms, tunnels, non-violent. Palestinians are always considered, targets and will be suppressed by the Israelis, is the point. I don't want to get into the whole sort of internationally enshrined right of resistance by any means, but, so those, people like that, people are, non-violent resisting every day, by cooking for their families, by writing, like our friend Rifat, who was, killed, who was a university professor. That's all he did. He said, the biggest weapon I have is an expo marker, and he was killed in a targeted assassination on him. He was told he was going to be killed, and then he was. So,
but right now they're in Gaza. They're just trying to survive. There are no activists right now.
Yeah, he might be meaning sort of the longer. Yeah.
Well, yes, after, I suppose.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to leave. I just want to say I tip my hat to the Palestinians and I stand with respect and all.
Send me, you have my number, right?
Yes.
Send me a message.
You, but you guys are.
Okay, well it is 1:30 now. But please, friends, keep ourselves focused here. So it's 1:30. We should probably wrap up. Laila is going to be at the book table for a little while.